Hello, my name is Hillel Wahrman, and I teach at Oranim Academic College of Education in Haifa, Israel. The topic of this presentation is philosophical. It deals with the question of educational aims. And the main thesis that I would like to present is that there are two different ways of approaching educational aims. And what I will be claiming is that educational aims, when educators think about them and contemplate them, are usually contemplated as contradictory. If you're thinking of one educational aim, it's usually undermining another educational aim. And since they are contradictory, it's a difficulty that educators deal with, thinking educators deal with, and this presentation would like to address these two ways of approaching contradictory logics of educational aims. So I will continue to share screen and hope you'll be able to see it. The topic of my presentation is how educators think about educational aims, a philosophical distinction between static and dynamic thinking. What do you think is the long-term aim of education? Is this aim your everyday compass? Should educators think about aims? As in many vocations, after many years, educators may lapse into routine, causing alienation and chronic suffering. Humanistic psychology and logotherapy cite clarifying aims as a process of restoring purpose and drive. A higher aim separates the wheat from the chaff for educators. Clarifying the aim focuses attention on the significant doing during the working day. An aim focuses attention on how to connect an immediate challenge with the mark one wants to make on the world. Many factors suppress educators into mere lower-level routine. The need to achieve immediate, quantifiable success, political pressures within schools, heavy workload, low pay. In other words, many educators are immersed in routine and do not think on the level of aims and do not think in the level of higher level aims, of primary aims, of long-term aims. Now, the constraints in thinking about aims are not only external or organizational, but they have to do with the nature of aims themselves. Aims themselves are a difficult topic. Even if organizations encourage educators to think about their aims, educators may refrain from clarifying their long-term aims. It is easier to visualize short-term objectives for today, this week, or this semester. Short-term objectives provide a positive, everyday sense of efficiency. The larger picture, what is the primary aim of education, is an abstract construct which might elude us, and that many educators could be working without that larger picture in mind. Its inception is an abstract philosophical wonder. What is the core of human growth? Such a question requires a highly motivated, lengthy, lifelong contemplation of long-term achievements. Such investigation requires leisure that frees from immediate concerns. What field faces this educator with such wonder, motivation, and leisure? Education is one of the humanities' most active theoretical battlegrounds. There are so many different schools of thought regarding what is education, what education should be striving for. An educator who enters this field finds a very complex field of ideas throughout history. The conversation is ongoing. What is education all about? What should it strive for? But the specific challenge this presentation wants to address is that the history of educational thought presents thinking educators with contradictory logics regarding primary educational aims. In other words, the various schools of thought are contradictory. In other words, educators find that if they promote a certain primary aim, they undermine the achievement of a contesting primary aim. Aims may be contradictory in their logic, but they could also be practically contradictory, as schools lack sufficient resources to pursue them all. So what the claim up to now is that educators should be thinking about their primary educational aims. But once they start to dwell on it, they find out that many of those aims are contradictory. So I would like to provide a few examples of how, through the history of education, one aim has contradicted the other aim. If we start with the Platonic educational aim, following Plato's lead, the prevailing proposition from antiquity to our days has been that knowing more means living better. The primary aim of our schools and universities should therefore be the acquisition of knowledge and rational thinking skills. Emotional development remains a responsibility of the private sphere, early age education, and only in the periphery of secondary school experience. So that's a very known aim for education, to impart knowledge and rational thinking skills. However, growing criticism is being directed against this focus on imparting knowledge and rationality in schools. Accumulating knowledge in schools is shown to have little effect on the lives of graduates. Most of the knowledge learned by most young students does not transfer, is not applied, is forgotten, and loses relevancy. We therefore can cite Bourdieu, who thought that what truly impacts people's milieu, status, and destiny is their embedded cultural capital, or habitus. In other words, it's not knowledge, it's what's embedded in them as a habitus. Rosenberg therefore claimed that this implies a distinction from the concept of learning. While learning refers to an increase in knowledge and skills within a habitus, education refers to the transformation of habitus itself. Education should not aim primarily at more and more knowledge and thinking skills. Instead, it should primarily aim at changing young students' habits of feeling and acting that are constrained by their environment. So the fundamental contradictory logics are, should schools aim primarily at students' intellect or at their embedded cultural capital or habitus? Which will free young students from the constraints of their environment, their intellect or their ingrained habits? More knowledge and rational skills does not change habits, and changing habits does not necessarily mean that it imports more knowledge and rational skills. Okay. The the major contradictory logic that we stated up to now is between aiming at the cognitive or aiming at the non-cognitive in school. What should our schools focus on, prioritize? Aiming at the cognitive or aiming at the non-cognitive? Now I'd like to show that even if you decide one of them, you still dwell into contradictory logics. So if we go into the realm of cognitive educational aims, we can find contradictory logics of what is knowledge itself. For instance, if we go into the hunter-gatherer proto-societies and how they understood knowledge, they idealize an education that instills children with concrete knowledge of their surroundings. The more concrete their knowledge, the more they can animate and relate intimately with things. This ideal is echoed also within Buddhism or qualitative research methods or outdoor educational philosophies that basically claim that exaggerated abstract thinking conceals the world more than it reveals. Well, this is a strong criticism against our usually Western schools that emphasize learning abstract knowledge. This theory would say that the more abstract the knowledge we teach, the more we're concealing the real world from our children. Aristotle contended that abstract thinking reveals truer knowledge than concrete occurrences. Education is therefore the transmission of perennial academic disciplines not available to hunter-gatherers. So here we have contradictory logics. Is true knowledge the concrete? Think of Buddhism. Or is true knowledge the abstract? The progressive ideology rejected the notion that knowledge, concrete or abstract, is transferable and accumulated. Knowledge is always of its time, becoming constantly reconstructed by the younger generations. In Kant's words, education is the encouragement of the young to use their own understanding. The German Bildung was the ideal of a fiercely independent mind. So what we have here is a third conception of what knowledge is. Knowledge is not a stable entity reflecting a truth. It's something that's every generation constructs and reconstructs. If we go to a fourth conception of what knowledge is, neo-Marxists reject the notion that knowledge is neutral. Instead, any knowledge arises within groups, and its status is related to the status of the group. Thus, knowledge of male, white, Western Europeans is given high visibility, while an enormous body of knowledge of the politically disadvantaged has been overlooked and erased. Education is a political project of promoting respect for knowledge of all cultures. So, if we think of those who choose the cognitive primary aim, and they think that schools should impart knowledge, well, they still have some contradictory logics to attend to. Which knowledge should schools therefore promote? The concrete, the abstract, individually constructed, or of non-male European white origins? But those who say schools should not work at promoting knowledge as its central core, that the primary aim of education is not the knowledge, but the irrational side of children and young people. Also, they face contradictory logics. The classical, non-cognitive educational aim was to instill in the young a culturally praised character, second nature virtues. Children were considered to be impulsive and chaotic and erratic, and what education should provide them is with a second nature of good tendencies, virtues that culture praises. This idea of instilling a character was very, very central to the Greek conceptions of non-cognitive education. Progressive ideology rejected the molding of children's character from the outside and instead idealized education that expresses children's existing natural impulses. If you think of the book Emile of Rousseau, it idealizes authenticity and self-fulfillment. Humanistic psychology called for education to encourage a youth to investigate their most inner meaningful core. So if you believe this is the primary aim of education, schools basically are there, excuse me, schools are basically there to help children discover themselves, discover what is their most deepest dream, their deepest drive, their core meaning. What is it? And live it, fulfill it. That's very different than instilling an outside character. So you have, up to now, two very different primary, non-cognitive primary aims. A third conception would be a neo-Marxist ideology that critic the ideal of character and the ideal of natural inclinations. Instead, both were perceived as oppressive, socially constructed habitus, and education's role is its disruption. This is a very strong criticism, saying that what schools should do is save children from their most personal inner drives, because it's not their own drives. Those drives were instilled into them in a socially oppressive manner. To free oneself from a consciousness that has been imposed upon you, that should be the primary aim of education. So what non-cognitive aims should schools therefore promote? Character formation, the opposite of character, unraveling personal, authentic, meaningful drives, or the opposite of character and natural drives, disrupting habitus. This paper wishes to discuss a philosophical distinction between the static and dynamic approaches to contradictory logics. If we're thinking about educational aims and we realize that they contradict each other, how should we approach them? First of all, philosophy is the process of making distinctions. This presentation is philosophical in the sense that at its core is a clarification of a distinction about approaching contradictory educational aims. The distinction is between static and dynamic approaches. The claim is that this distinction should be deliberated by individual educators, educator training programs, schools, and educational systems. A position within this distinction is pivotal for conceptualizing the treatment of educational aims. So we have the static approach on the one side and the dynamic approach on the other side, and they both are philosophical positions in the sense that they're rooted in the most general premises, ontological and epistemological premises. In the static approach, the ontological premise is that reality, all reality, educational reality as well, but all reality is composed of firm universal principles. An educator of this persuasion will assume that students also comply with universal educational principles. And an epistemological premise is that to capture reality, human constructed concepts should adhere to the law of non-contradiction. If one concept is accepted, then a contrary concept must be rejected. The static way of thinking is therefore deterred by contradictory logics and strives to resolve tensions by choosing either one theory or the other. Contradictions are conceived as a problem. It calls upon educators to choose between contrary theories. If a theory is accepted, then the opposing theory must be rejected. An educator will derive from the chosen theory a coherent, consistent educational scheme and work to implement it, calling upon educators to defend its logic and remain steady in their choice against the frequent change of fashion, of peers, and public discourse. If you followed the line of thought here, this is a very common way of thinking about contradictory logics. If there is a contradiction, then either one statement is true, one proposition is true, or the other proposition is true. You can't have both true. So if you believe, for instance, in character formation, you cannot believe in a progressive authentic drive. No, you would like to instill character. And if you believe in character formation, you cannot believe in habitus disruption because you believe that the character is culturally praised, and you would like to instill that character. And while a habitus disruption says that you should fear that character formation is just one way of one group to rule over another group by instilling a character that's against a habitus, really, that is against their own interest. Schools should disrupt this kind of habitus. We turn now to the dynamic approach, and the dynamic approach is a more interesting approach, which less people will hold, but it should be considered and deliberated. An ontological premise would be that reality is composed of incomprehensible and contradictory elements. An educator of this persuasion will assume that students are too complex, non-unified, and self-contradictory for any single theory. Human constructed concepts are inconsistency seeking. They need to capture the complexity of contradictory elements in any phenomena. The dynamic way of thinking is attracted to contradictory logics as a mean of penetrating deeper layers of reality. Contradictory theories and educational schemes are considered an asset, penetrating deeper layers of students and societies. It calls upon educators to combine contrary theories, inviting them to attempt to encompass multiple outlooks simultaneously on a regular basis. The educator should idealize incoherent, inconsistent educational schemes, attentive to emerging complexities and responding with constant modification, idealizing educators who regularly change perspectives. This means that you could work at instilling character and educate towards authenticity. Educate towards authenticity and disrupt a person's authentic drives by disrupting his habitus. Teaching and transmitting cultural knowledge and encouraging children to construct their own individual knowledge. Although it's contradictory, although these primary aims have contradictory logics, they should be contained together. The dynamic envisions educators who regularly change their educational ideology. Our conclusion, therefore, Educators should exert efforts to clarify their primary educational aims. The history of education presents contradictory logics regarding what those primary educational aims should be. Educators may tend towards a static either-or approach, choosing one aim over the other, rejecting contesting aims, replacing older aims, and building a consistent and stable educational worldview. Other educational aims are discarded or pushed away to the periphery of school efforts. However, educators may tend towards a dynamic approach, tolerant of contradictory educational aims, moving between them, adding them to their arsenal of aims. These aims are considered to address contradictory needs and traits within human beings and serve as a means of penetrating more deeply into the contradictions of human growth. A consistent educational worldview is conceived as not flexible and not adaptive enough to changing needs. Complexity of aim is idealized. Schools become a field of many complex actions and procedures, seemingly undermining each other, but in truth, they are complementary. Education is a nonlinear, messy endeavor in need of ideologically flexible educators. Thank you very much, and I hope that the distinction between static and dynamic approaches to contradictory educational aims will help to expand the way we all can treat educational aims in schools. And I believe that this distinction should be deliberated by individual educators, but also by educators' training programs and school systems. Thank you very much.